Let's begin by stepping into the world of Midnight's Children, a sprawling, richly layered narrative that blends personal family history with the grand sweep of India's tumultuous 20th century evolution. Written by Salman Rushdie and published in 1981, this novel takes us through an intricate tapestry of events, from the final days of British colonial rule in the Indian subcontinent, through the dawn of independence, the troubled formation of Pakistan, the upheavals of war, and the era of political strife and emergency measures. At the heart of this mosaic stands our narrator and protagonist, Saleem Sinai, whose very existence is inseparably linked to the life of the newly independent nation. Born at the stroke of midnight on August 15, 1947, the precise moment India gained its freedom, Saleem is endowed with extraordinary telepathic powers, as are other children born in that first hour of independence. Their fates, talents, and misfortunes are all tied to the destiny of the subcontinent itself. What follows is a spoiler-filled summary that will guide you through the novel's complicated family lines, historical milestones, supernatural occurrences, and personal tragedies. By the end, you'll have a comprehensive understanding of the narrative's flow, the characters' inner transformations, the major themes that animate the story, and the emotive resonance that lingers long after the final page. Before diving into the chronological unfolding of events, it's vital to understand how the story is told. Saleem Sinai recounts his life from a pickle factory in the late 1970s, where he sits in a state of physical disintegration, falling to pieces, as he puts it, dictating his memories to a patient and sometimes skeptical companion, Padma, a woman who works at the factory. This framing device immerses us in a dual time frame, the present moment of Saleem's retelling, and the sprawling tapestry of his past. Padma's occasional interruptions and reassurances keep the narrative grounded, reminding us that Saleem's story is a reflection, a grand work of memory, subject to the whims, anxieties, and biases of the storyteller. Saleem, the narrator, believes he must finish this tale before he quite literally cracks apart. This sense of impending doom creates a tension that hums beneath the narrative, as if time is always running out. From the start, we know that Saleem's life mirrors the trajectory of India as a nation. His fortunes and misfortunes are inseparably linked to historical events. The personal and the political will become indistinguishable as we proceed. To understand Saleem's birth at midnight and the circumstances that led to it, we must first trace the roots of his family. We begin in Kashmir, before independence, with Saleem's grandfather, Adam Aziz, a doctor educated in Germany. Upon returning home, Dr. Aziz struggles to reconcile Western modernity with the old world traditions and religious faith of his homeland. This cultural and spiritual tension within him sets a precedent. It's he who first bends down to pray on a frozen field and, hitting his nose on the ground, experiences a symbolic moment of doubt and spiritual disconnection. Adam Aziz's first encounters with Naseem Ghani, who would become his wife and Saleem's grandmother, are conducted strangely. He sees her only through a perforated sheet as he's called upon to treat different ailments in various parts of her body. Their love blossoms indirectly, without direct sight, culminating in a marriage that represents a union of old and new. Yet this marriage is fraught with differing values. Adam grows more secular and rational, while Naseem clings to religious tradition and conservative views. This tension will reverberate through generations. After marrying, Adam and Naseem settle in Agra, near the Taj Mahal. They raise a family during a period when India is heading towards independence. Their household becomes a microcosm of the country's transitions. Arguments between religion and secularism, old and new ways of life, hope and fear. Among their children is Amina Sinai, Saleem's mother, who will later navigate a web of relationships and identities before giving birth to our protagonist. Also entangled in the family's life is Nadir Khan, a gentle, intellectual poet who takes refuge in the Aziz household after running afoul of political powers. He will, for a time, be betrothed to Amina, then known as Mumtaz, but fate and politics intervene. Eventually, Mumtaz divorces Nadir Khan and marries Ahmed Sinai, changing her name to Amina. The Sinais will move to Bombay, seeking prosperity in the new India. It's in these shifting settings from Kashmir to Agra, then onward to big cities, that we see a pattern emerge. Each generation tries to redefine itself in the face of India's changing identity. As independence looms, these personal upheavals mirror the looming historical watershed. Then comes the pivotal moment. On August 15, 1947, at the precise stroke of midnight, India becomes an independent nation. At that exact moment, Saleem Sinai is born in Bombay, amidst the jubilant noise of celebration and fireworks. Unbeknownst to Saleem's family, another baby boy, Shiva, is born at the same time, in the same hospital, to a poor street entertainer's wife. A nurse named Mary Pereira, motivated by love and idealistic impulses, switches the name tags of the two newborns. This action secretly swaps their destinies. The wealthy Sinai baby and the poor entertainer's son exchange lives. From this swap emerges one of the novel's core themes: how fate and social position can turn on the smallest, most arbitrary moments. Saleem, raised as a Sinai, grows up believing himself to be the child of privilege and education. Shiva, meanwhile, grows up in poverty but with remarkable strength and cunning. Both boys, and hundreds of others born in that first hour of independence, are part of an extraordinary group known as the Midnight's Children, each endowed with magical powers. Saleem's special gift is telepathy, a powerful ability that allows him to communicate with all the other Midnight's children, forming a kind of psychic conference where he tries to unite them. But these children's powers vary widely, reflecting the vast diversity of India itself. This magical element of the story weaves myth and fantasy into the historical fabric. Through Saleem's telepathic Midnight Children's Conference, the novel creates a metaphor for India's astonishing pluralism. So many languages, religions, castes, and classes struggling to find unity. Saleem, in his youthful idealism, hopes to rally these special children to do good, to represent a positive force in the newborn nation. But as we'll see, their unity is not easily maintained. Saleem's childhood unfolds against a vibrant backdrop of Bombay, Mumbai, in the 1950s. We encounter a host of memorable relatives and neighbors who surround the young Saleem. There's his father, Ahmed Sinai, a businessman struggling with alcohol and financial instability, and his mother, Amina, who carries emotional scars from her first marriage. Extended family members, each with their quirks and obsessions, populate Saleem's world, contributing to a rich domestic tapestry that mirrors India's own complicated familial ties. As a boy, Saleem becomes aware of his telepathic abilities, though at first he only senses the presence of others, like a radio receiving static. Over time, he learns to tune into distinct voices, discovering that all children born in that magical hour have gifts. Some can travel through time, some have incredible intellect, others can shift their gender at will, and so on. Notably, Shiva, Saleem's mirrored counterpart, has the gift of warlike prowess, a kind of martial genius. Their differences in temperament and social position foreshadow conflicts to come. While Saleem wants to use their abilities to foster unity and understanding, Shiva dismisses these lofty ideals. He's more pragmatic and aggressive. This tension reflects India's struggles. Idealists versus realists, pacifists versus warriors, secularists versus nationalists. As Saleem grows, India's political scene intensifies. The country that gained independence at Saleem's birth is now navigating the messy process of creating a cohesive national identity. Religious tensions rise, linguistic states are reorganized, and political corruption looms. The Sino-Indian War, the border disputes, and the lingering trauma of partition provide a constant, unsettling backdrop. Saleem's family experiences upheavals too. Ahmed Sinai's business flounders, and he faces a personal breakdown. The family moves to Pakistan for a time as tensions between India and Pakistan escalate, with the hope of finding stability in Karachi. Saleem's life in Pakistan is marked by a loss of innocence. The glamorous images he held of his family's unity and his own place in the world start to crack. The Sinais do not find the success they hoped for. Instead, they are caught up in the political and social ferment of a country forging its own identity separate from India's. Saleem's existence increasingly becomes an allegory for the subcontinent's fractured spirit. When war breaks out, first the Indo-Pakistani conflicts of the 1960s, then the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971, Saleem finds himself literally in the middle of history. During these turbulent years, personal tragedies strike. Many family members die or disappear, forcing Saleem to confront loss on an intimate scale that echoes the broader national tragedies. By the mid-1960s, Saleem struggles to maintain the Midnight's Children Conference. The children, no longer innocents, become divided by their regional, religious, and ideological differences. Where once they could gather telepathically in a spirit of curiosity, now their differences tear them apart. Some reject Saleem's leadership and idealism. Others vanish into their own paths. Shiva, who despises Saleem's naive unity dreams, becomes a key antagonist. He represents the hard edge of power and physical might, showing that brute strength often prevails in a contentious world. The disintegration of the conference parallels the fraying fabric of India's unity. The linguistic reorganization of states, the rising sectarianism, and the numerous political cracks mean that the dream of a single, harmonious India remains elusive. Saleem is devastated by this failure. Not only does he lose this group he considered family, he also loses faith in his own special role. Instead of being the unifier, he becomes a witness to fragmentation. After tragedies in the family and the failure of the conference, Saleem ends up in Pakistan again during the 1971 war. Traumatized and in shock from losing so many relatives, he suffers amnesia. His memory, which he once used to spin his identity, now deserts him. Symbolically, as the subcontinent splits again, this time East Pakistan becoming Bangladesh, Saleem's own sense of self dissolves. In this state, Saleem becomes embroiled in the war almost accidentally. He's taken in by a group known as the Magician's Ghetto, a troupe of performers and oddities that includes Parvati the Witch, another Midnight's child who can conjure illusions. This period of Saleem's life is marked by disorientation. He exists as a tool of history, swept along by events he can neither understand nor control, a literal soldier forced into a war he never desired. Eventually, Saleem returns to India, more broken than before, and Parvati the Witch helps him re-establish some semblance of a life. In a desperate attempt at normalcy and love, Parvati tries to build a family with Saleem. When Saleem fails to marry her according to societal expectations, Parvati turns to Shiva, who by now is a powerful figure in the Indian army. She becomes pregnant with Shiva's child. Ironically, Saleem will later raise this child, Adam Sinai, as his own, continuing the cycle of uncertain parentage and mixed identities. One of the novel's climactic moments occurs during Indira Gandhi's emergency, 1975 to 1977, a period marked by the suspension of democratic rights, mass sterilization campaigns, and the stifling of political opposition. Under the guise of national discipline, the state cracks down on freedoms. For Saleem and the other surviving Midnight's children, this emergency is more than a political event. It's the final, violent clampdown on their magical legacy. The government, represented symbolically and literally by Shiva, who by now is closely associated with the authoritarian regime, hunts down Saleem and the other special children. In a cruel twist, the children's powers are surgically removed. This act of sterilization and enforced conformity shows how the state crushes individuality and diversity, the very qualities that define the Midnight's children. Saleem, who once believed these children to be the hope of the nation, sees that hope destroyed by realpolitik and authoritarian force. The emergency becomes a metaphor for the death of dreams, both personal and national. Without their extraordinary gifts, the Midnight's children are just ordinary citizens, forced to live under a regime that fears and punishes difference. Shiva's role in all this is crucial. The baby switched at birth, who should have grown up in Saleem's privileged place, ends up wielding the blunt instrument of power, brutality, and force, aligning with a state that represses the very ideals Saleem cherished. The rivalry between these two brothers thus reflects the ongoing battle in India's heart. The struggle between compassion and cruelty, unity and fragmentation, idealism and cynicism. In the wake of the emergency's end, Saleem is left a hollowed-out version of his former self. He survives, as does Parvati's child, whom Saleem names Adam Sinai. But the world he knew, the magical link to India's birth hour, is gone. Parvati, tragically, does not survive. She dies, leaving Saleem with her child, an echo of how Saleem himself was raised by parents who did not know his true origins. Having lost his telepathy, his family, and nearly everyone he cared about, Saleem tries to find meaning in the ordinary. He ends up working at a pickle factory in Bombay, engaged in the careful preservation of spices and flavors. The pickles become a metaphor for memory and storytelling. Just as pickling preserves food for future consumption, Saleem's narrative preserves the stories of his family, the Midnight's children, and the nation in words and images. He's trying to chutnify his history, capturing its essence in a form that can outlast political disasters. Throughout the story, identity is a central theme. Saleem's very existence is defined by a switch destiny. The notion that a single action, a nurse-swapping name tags, can set one life on a path of privilege and another on a path of hardship is a profound commentary on social inequality and the randomness of fate. Saleem struggled to understand who he is, Muslim or Indian, privileged or disenfranchised, special or ordinary, reflects India's own struggle to define itself as a secular democracy made up of countless communities. History and memory are another key focus. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes that history is not a fixed record, but a fluid story shaped by those who tell it. Saleem, as narrator, often acknowledges that he might be mixing things up, reordering events for dramatic effect, or giving too much importance to personal moments. In this way, Rushdie suggests that how we remember the past, what we preserve, and what we omit is as important as what actually happened. Memory becomes an act of creation, and Saleem's story is a grand act of memory-making. He's writing India's narrative through the lens of his own life. Diversity and fragmentation resonate both in the human characters and the magical children. The Midnight's children represent India's huge variety, geographical, cultural, and linguistic differences compressed into a single generation. Initially united by a shared birthday, they fall apart because of the very differences they embody. Just as post-independence India failed to stay immune to religious strife and political corruption, the children cannot remain a harmonious group. The novel suggests that true unity is elusive. Yet, it's the attempt to reconcile differences, rather than the success, that defines the moral effort of a nation and an individual. Power and corruption loom large. The story grapples with how idealistic visions, like those of a grand, secular, democratic India, are undermined by unscrupulous leaders, violence, and authoritarian crackdowns. Shiva's ascent to power and the sterilization of the Midnight's children during the emergency are metaphors for a state apparatus that fears the creative chaos of its people's diversity. This critique extends beyond India's borders, highlighting universal concerns about how political systems handle dissent and difference. As Saleem concludes his narrative, we find him in the pickle factory, engaged to Padma, trying to finish his story before he falls apart. His physical disintegration symbolizes the fragility of memory and identity. He is quite literally cracking under the weight of historical, personal, and narrative burdens. However, despite all the losses, Saleem's life is not devoid of meaning. He passes on the mantle to Saleem Sinai, the next generation, who carries within him the potential for renewal. Even if the Midnight's children are scattered or stripped of their powers, their legacy endures in memory and story. In these final moments, the novel ends on a note that is simultaneously tragic and hopeful. Saleem does not pretend that all the damage done can be undone. He's painfully aware that the golden promise of that midnight birth in 1947 did not guarantee a happily ever after for the nation or for himself. But the fact that he can tell this story, preserving it in chutney form for future listeners, suggests that hope lies in the act of storytelling itself. By sharing these memories, he ensures that the lessons of his life and generation might guide future ones. In short, narrative becomes an act of cultural and historical preservation. Reading or hearing about Midnight's children, one cannot help but feel the intensity of Saleem's personal emotional journey. He begins with mythic grandeur, a baby born at the exact moment of independence, destined for greatness. He befriends extraordinary children with miraculous abilities. But as the narrative progresses, we see those abilities founder on the hard rocks of real-world politics and violence. We experience Saleem's terror during wars, his heartbreak at family deaths, and the crushing disappointment of the emergency. By the end, we understand his longing to make sense of a life that has slipped through his fingers as the nation's idealistic dawn turned into a muddled midday and a stormy afternoon. The emotional truth of the story emerges from these tensions between hope and despair, unity and disintegration. The novel never provides an easy resolution, much as real history does not. Instead, it encourages us to appreciate the complexity of identity and the importance of memory. Rushdie's narrative is notoriously rich in sensory details. Though this is a summary, it's worth emphasizing how the novel immerses us in the smells, tastes, and sights of the subcontinent. From the spices in the kitchens where Naseem and Amina cook, to the bustling street life of Bombay, to the grandeur and decay of old mansions, the story's atmosphere is thick with textures. We encounter the scent of pickles and chutneys that Saleem will later produce, and these culinary motifs become metaphors for preserving history's flavors. This sensory richness is not just decorative. It underscores the theme that identity, national, cultural, personal, is not just an abstract concept. It's lived daily, tasted in food, heard in languages, and seen in architecture. Through Saleem's journey, we realize that understanding India's story means engaging with its kaleidoscopic sensory reality. By the time we've journeyed through the entire narrative, we appreciate the magnitude of what Rushdie attempted and what Saleem Sinai represents. Midnight's Children is ultimately a love letter to the complexity of India, acknowledging that its identity cannot be pinned down easily. Through Saleem's voice, we see that India's birth was accompanied by high hopes, miraculous potential embodied by the Midnight's Children, and a hunger for unity. Yet, as decades pass, politics, war, sectarian strife, and authoritarian measures dismantle these dreams. Unity frays, children disperse, powers vanish. What remains is a man narrating his story into a pickle jar, an image that poignantly captures both loss and endurance. In the end, Saleem's life and India's narrative blur so completely that we cannot separate them. His personal heartbreak echoes the disillusionment of a nation that struggled to live up to its founding ideals. His survival and act of storytelling hint that, despite everything, memory endures. And with memory comes the possibility of understanding and, perhaps, future redemption. Midnight's Children does not give us a neat, feel-good ending. Instead, it invites reflection. It provokes questions about fate, identity, and history. It challenges us to consider what it means to inherit a nation's birthright and bear the burden of its shortcomings. Most importantly, it reminds us that the stories we tell and how we choose to preserve them shape our understanding of who we are and where we come from. By the novel's conclusion, we have witnessed Saleem's entire trajectory, from miracle child to wounded survivor, from would-be unifier of a magical generation to a solitary chronicler, preserving the taste of history for generations to come. In this sense, the story's emotional journey concludes with a bittersweet awareness. Hope and disappointment walk hand in hand, and the past, no matter how painful, can be preserved, examined, and understood if we have the courage to tell the story truthfully, with all its fractures and ambiguities.